If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. I had always loved urban exploration, but this was something else entirely. The place wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. It started with a dare. My friend Jason had shown me an old forum post about a theme park deep in the woods, one that had supposedly been shut down years ago. The official records said it had closed in 1998 after a series of unexplained accidents, but according to some late night whispers online, it never truly shut down. The rides still moved, the lights still flickered, and if you went after dark, you'd see the workers waiting. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about this one crawled under my skin. So, on a humid summer night, I packed a flashlight, a camera, and a pocket knife just in case, and made my way through the overgrown path leading to Eversmile amusement park. As soon as I stepped past the rusting entrance gate, something felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of stale popcorn and something else, something metallic. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the towering silhouette of the Ferris wheel. It was moving, slowly, creaking, like a great mechanical beast waking from its slumber. But there was no wind, no power lines, no reason for it to move. A soft, rhythmic tune drifted from the distance, carnival music. My blood ran cold. Then I saw them, a row of figures standing near the carousel, dressed in faded uniforms, their faces pale under the flickering neon lights. They weren't moving, they weren't breathing, but their eyes followed me. I froze. The figures near the carousel stood eerily still, their faded uniforms hanging loosely on their frames. The dim, flickering neon sign above them illuminated their faces lifeless, expressionless, yet somehow aware. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching against gravel and discarded ticket stubs. The music playing from the carousel wasn't coming from any speakers I could see, and yet the distorted notes of an old carnival tune echoed through the silent park. The Ferris wheel continued its slow, groaning rotation, but I forced my eyes away from it. I needed to confirm something first. I raised my flashlight and aimed it directly at one of the employees. The beam hit him straight in the face, revealing cracked mannequin-like skin stretched over a rigid structure. But his eyes weren't glass or plastic. They were real, bloodshot, human, and filled with something I couldn't name. I staggered back. The beam of my flashlight wobbled as my hands trembled. The figure didn't blink, didn't move. Just watched, then the carousel jerked to life. The sudden movement made me flinch, and the skeletal horses attached to the ride began to rise and fall, their chipped paint revealing rusted metal beneath. The ride spun faster, its haunting melody warping into a high-pitched, discordant mess, and then one of the figures stepped forward. The sound of grinding gears filled the air, followed by a single, hollow click. I turned on my heel and ran. I sprinted through the park, my breath ragged and my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound of the carousel's warped tune chased me through the darkness, an eerie soundtrack to my growing terror. The figure that had stepped forward, was it following me? I risked a glance over my shoulder. At first, there was nothing. Just the eerie glow of neon lights flickering above the rides and booths. The towering Ferris wheel creaked in the distance, its seats swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. Then I saw it. One of the employees was standing at the entrance of the carousel, its rigid form casting a long shadow across the cracked pavement. I could swear its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging me. I pushed forward, rounding a bend near the old haunted house attraction. The entrance was gaping open, its fake cobwebs hanging limp and brittle. A sign above the doorway read, "Enter if you dare." Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have dared, but at that moment, anything seemed better than staying out in the open. I plunged inside. The air inside the attraction was thick with dust. the scent of old fabric and rotting wood clinging to every breath I took. My flashlight flickered as I stepped deeper into the darkness. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I wasn't alone. I pressed my back against a rotting wooden panel, forcing my breath to slow. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the attraction, a voice whispered low, raspy, and inhuman, "You shouldn't be here." A cold shiver crawled down my spine. And then something moved. The whisper sent a shudder through me, curling around my senses like cold, damp fingers. "You shouldn't be here." The words hadn't come from right behind me. No, they were deeper inside the haunted house attraction. But the voice carried, stretching through the hollow corridors like a breath from something ancient, something that had been waiting. I swallowed down the lump in my throat and steadied my breathing. I had no choice but to move forward. Going back outside was worse. I wasn't even sure if I was still being chased, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the employee from the carousel hadn't simply let me go. I moved deeper into the attraction, each step causing the floor beneath me to creak. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, fake spiderwebs sagging in the corners. Animatronic figures stood frozen in place, hulking vampires with outstretched arms, witches with pointy hats, and clowns with jagged grins. The haunted house had clearly been abandoned for years, but something about it felt recently disturbed. The dust in the air had been unsettled, like someone or something had walked through here not long ago. I reached a fork in the corridor. One path veered to the left, marked by a faded sign that read "The Maze of Shadows" in dripping, blood-red paint. The other led to a dimly lit stairwell descending into darkness. No sign, no indication of where it went. Just an open, waiting void. A gust of cold air rushed past me from below, carrying with it the faintest trace of something rotten. And then I heard it again, the whisper, "You shouldn't be here." But this time the voice was closer. I spun around. The clown animatronic that had been frozen just seconds ago wasn't in the same place anymore. My chest tightened. Had I imagined it? Maybe I had been so lost in my panic that I hadn't noticed it shifting slightly on its rusted track. Maybe a motor inside had suddenly jolted to life after years of disrepair. But then I noticed something even worse. Its eyes, they weren't glassy and dull like the other animatronics. They were watching me. I stepped back, my foot brushing against something small and metallic. I looked down and saw a brass key lying on the floor, half buried in the dust. It was old, rusted, with an ornate handle that had a strange symbol carved into it. A perfect circle, with a single line slashing through the middle. Instinct screamed at me to leave it alone. But my hand was already moving, fingers curling around the icy metal. As soon as I lifted the key from the dust, the entire attraction seemed to breathe. The walls groaned, shifting slightly as if the building had exhaled. The dim lights flickered violently, shadows twisting in ways that didn't match the objects casting them. Then a loud bang erupted from somewhere behind me. I turned in time to see the clown animatronic lurch forward. It didn't move smoothly like a machine, didn't jitter and jolt like something controlled by old wiring. No, it stepped, one slow, deliberate step. I stumbled backward toward the staircase. I had seconds to decide, take my chances in the shadowy maze ahead, or descend into whatever waited below. Then the whisper returned, clearer than ever, "You shouldn't be here, but now that you are, you can't leave." A low, metallic creaking came from all around me as the other animatronics shifted. Their heads turned toward me in unison. The decision was made for me. I bolted down the stairs into the darkness. I plunged down the stairwell, each step groaning beneath my weight. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the air became thick like I was running through something denser than mere shadows. The moment I hit the landing, the lights above flickered violently, casting monstrous silhouettes along the damp walls. Then bang, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. I whipped around, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle and twisted. Locked. No. No, no, no. A metallic creak echoed from behind me. My spine stiffened. I turned slowly, the brass key still clutched in my sweating palm. The stairwell had led to a basement. But it wasn't a maintenance room or storage area. It was something else. Rows of glass display cases stretched into the distance, coated in layers of dust so thick they looked like they had been untouched for decades. Faint bulbs flickered from the ceiling, bathing everything in a weak yellow glow. The walls were lined with old posters, vintage park advertisements. But something was wrong. The people in the posters, their faces were missing, not blurred, not torn away. Just gone, like someone had carefully removed them, leaving nothing but blank voids where their eyes and mouths should have been. A shiver ran through me. I stepped closer to one of the display cases. Inside, resting atop a black velvet cushion, was a small wooden puppet. Its limbs were twisted unnaturally, its jaw slightly unhinged, revealing rows of human-like teeth. Its fingers were long and jointed, curled into something like a beckoning motion. There was a plaque beneath it. I wiped away the dust with my sleeve and squinted at the faded engraving. The first employee. I recoiled, my stomach twisting. What the hell did that mean? A chill crawled up my spine as I turned to the next case. This one held something even worse, a tattered uniform. The kind of uniform the employees at the park wore. The same kind the man at the carousel had been wearing. It was displayed on a mannequin, but the longer I stared at it, the more I realized something unsettling. It wasn't empty. The fabric was bulging slightly at the torso, the arms sagging in a way that suggested something was still inside it. I took a step back. The air in the basement had become stifling, pressing against my lungs like invisible hands. And then the puppet's head snapped toward me. I didn't have time to scream. A scraping sound filled the room, a slow, deliberate drag of something heavy against the floor. My breath hitched. I turned my head. The mannequin in the uniform had shifted. It had been facing forward just seconds ago. Now it was looking directly at me. I could hear my own heartbeat slamming against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place as I stared at the blank, shadowed face where a head should be. And then, without warning, a voice whispered right against my ear. The park never closes. The lights flickered violently, and when they came back on, the mannequin was gone. The air left my lungs in a choked, silent scream. Something was in here with me, and it was watching. The mannequin was gone. The display cases remained, the puppet still grinning with its two human teeth. But the uniform, the thing that had been inside it, had vanished. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. I needed to get out of here, now. I turned, searching for another exit. The basement was sprawling, stretching into an endless hallway of flickering bulbs and dust-coated relics of the park's past. Somewhere beyond the dim light, I swore I heard footsteps, not the sharp click of boots, not the shuffle of sneakers. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My pulse hammered in my throat. I started forward, gripping the brass key so tightly it bit into my palm. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I prayed it would be a way out. Each step sent up tiny clouds of dust. The air here was thick, too thick, like a place sealed away from the world for longer than it should have been. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a door, old and wooden, its surface warped from time and dampness. I rushed toward it, shoving my weight against it, but it barely budged. There was no lock, just an old-fashioned handle that refused to turn. I glanced back, my breath quickening. The dragging sound was closer. I twisted the handle harder. It groaned under the pressure, but wouldn't move. And then the lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, I saw something at the far end of the hall. A figure, dressed in the same uniform as the employees, motionless, watching. The light came back on. And the figure was closer. I staggered back, my chest tightening with panic. The door had to open. There had to be a way. My fingers fumbled along the surface until I felt it. A keyhole. I didn't stop to think. I shoved the brass key into the lock and turned. A click, a rush of air as the door finally gave way. I stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. Silence. My breathing was ragged. My back pressed against the wood. My fingers still wrapped around the key. The air on this side of the door was different, colder. I took a hesitant step forward, blinking as my eyes adjusted. I was in a room, a small office. The walls were lined with old file cabinets, their surfaces rusted and dented. Papers were scattered across the desk, yellowed with age. A cracked leather chair sat in the center, the air around it wrong, like it had been occupied not long ago. A single lamp flickered on the desk, casting long, trembling shadows, and then I saw it. A ledger, a massive, bound book, resting open as if someone had been reading it moments before I entered. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The pages were filled with names, thousands of names, each carefully written in fading ink. I ran my fingers down the columns, my pulse slowing just enough for my mind to catch up. These were employees. A record. My eyes darted to the last page, the most recent entries, and that's when my breath caught in my throat. There were still names being added. Right in front of me, the ink was writing itself. A new name appeared, letter by letter. And as I watched in horror, my own name began to form. I staggered back from the ledger, my pulse hammering in my ears. My name was still forming, letter by letter, stroke by stroke. The ink was fresh, glistening under the dim light of the flickering lamp. I wiped my damp palms against my jeans, my breath coming in sharp gasps. This wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. And yet it was happening. A noise creaked behind me. I spun, my heart slamming against my ribs. The office door, the one I had locked, was open. No, not open, unlatched, like something had just left. I scanned the small room, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk for balance. There was only one way out, and it was back through that door. But I didn't want to go back into that hallway. Not when I knew something had been watching me. I forced myself to look down at the ledger one last time. The moment my eyes landed on the page, my stomach twisted into knots. My name was no longer there. The ink had vanished. As if it had never been written in the first place. Instead, a new name had taken its place. A name I didn't recognize. Lucas Thorne. My pulse slowed just enough for unease to set in. Who was Lucas Thorne? Why had my name disappeared? I hesitated for a moment before flipping back through the pages. Each entry had a date beside it, stretching back decades. Some as far back as the early 1900s. Each name marked an employee, but something felt wrong. The earliest entries had dates of hire. But the later ones, the recent ones, only had one date, no termination date, no records of anyone leaving. It was as if everyone who worked here had never left. A gust of air swept through the office, making the pages flutter. I tensed, my grip tightening around the edge of the desk. The door creaked again. I wasn't alone. A shadow shifted in the dim hallway beyond the doorway. Slow, unhurried, like something was waiting for me to step out. I needed to leave now. I moved carefully, keeping my footsteps light. The air smelled of dust and something stale. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight as I stepped toward the door, holding my breath. And then a voice, soft, barely a whisper, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The voice was right next to me, close enough that I should have felt breath against my skin, but there was no one there. I spun around, my stomach lurching. The room was empty. The only thing that had changed was the ledger. It was open to a new page, and at the top, in fresh ink, was another name. Lucas Thorne, terminated. A chill rushed down my spine. Terminated. I had just seen his name appear under new hires. What had happened to him? Something moved outside the door. A shape. A figure, standing still in the hallway. The same uniform, the same eerie stillness, but I knew, without a doubt, that this one was different. Because this one had a name tag, Lucas Thorne. My breath caught. His head tilted slightly, the motion unnatural, like he was struggling to move. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised a hand. He pointed at me. The lights flickered. And the last thing I saw before darkness swallowed the room was Lucas Thorne stepping forward. I couldn't move. Lucas Thorne was standing in the doorway, his name tag glinting under the dim, flickering lights. His face was eerily blank, expressionless, as if he had forgotten how to wear emotions. And yet something in his posture felt off. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, his fingers curled slightly. His uniform was pristine, the same dark blue as the others I had seen wandering the park. But there was something else, something colder. His lips twitched, a jerky, unnatural movement, like a puppet attempting to smile. The name ledger was still open on the desk behind me, the ink on his name barely dry. My stomach twisted with unease. Was it possible? Had I just watched someone be created, or worse, replaced? The door creaked as Lucas took a step forward. I snapped out of my trance, stumbling backward. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, my body screaming at me to run. But the moment I took another step back, his head jerked, snapping toward me in a single, unnatural motion. His mouth opened, but there was no voice, only a dry, rasping breath. Something was wrong with him, and I needed to get out, now. I lunged for the door, but the second I did, Lucas moved, not walked. Not stepped, but shifted. One moment he was at the threshold. The next, he was right in front of me. Too fast, too sudden, too wrong. I recoiled, a strangled gasp escaping my throat. His eyes were hollow. Glass-like. His lips parted again, and this time a voice whispered out. Soft, hollow, "You shouldn't be here." The same words. The same warning, but I didn't wait to find out what came next. I bolted. The hallway outside the office was longer than I remembered. The flickering bulbs overhead barely illuminated the darkened walls, casting warped shadows that stretched as I ran. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, but the further I ran, the more the hallway seemed to stretch. The walls narrowed, the air thickened, and then, from behind me, footsteps, not one set, many, too many. I didn't dare look back. I kept running, my breath ragged, my legs burning. My pulse hammered against my skull, each heartbeat a countdown to something inevitable. And then a door, at the end of the corridor, just barely visible through the flickering lights. I slammed into it full force. My fingers scrambled for the handle, twisting it desperately. The door groaned, reluctant, like it had been locked for years. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder. I yanked at the handle, a choked cry of frustration escaping my lips. The door wouldn't budge. Then something touched my shoulder, cold, light, almost gentle. I felt my stomach drop. I spun around, and for the first time I saw them. Not just Lucas, but all of them, a dozen, maybe more. All wearing the same pristine uniforms. Their name tags glistened under the flickering light. Their faces were eerily still. Eyes that didn't blink, lips that twitched. They weren't human, they never had been. A hollow whisper crawled through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment the world felt weightless, like I was suspended in a void with nothing beneath my feet, nothing above me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my fingers still locked around the ice-cold door handle. The air had thickened, pressing against my lungs like I was breathing through wet cloth. And then a sound, not footsteps, not voices, something far worse, a low, guttural humming. It started as a whisper, vibrating through the air like an old amusement ride powering up. Deep, mechanical, inhuman, it seeped into my bones, filling every inch of space around me, pressing against my skull. And just like that, the lights came back on. But they weren't the same. The entire corridor had changed. I wasn't standing in the cramped hallway anymore. The walls had vanished. The flickering ceiling lights had been replaced by a row of carnival bulbs, glowing in eerie red and yellow hues. Beneath my feet, polished wood stretched forward like a path. almost like I was standing at the entrance of a ride. My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't possible. I had been in the maintenance building. I had been running down the hallway. There had been them, the uniformed figures, the not quite humans, and now I was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere worse. A sign loomed ahead, suspended by rusted metal poles. Its paint had chipped away in places, but the lettering was still legible under the dull glow of the bulbs. Step right up. The ride of a lifetime awaits. Beneath it, an entrance stretched open, its archway carved in the shape of a grinning clown's mouth. The teeth were jagged, uneven, their edges stained with something dark. The clown's eyes were empty sockets, gaping black voids that seemed to stare straight into my soul. And just outside the entrance, a figure stood waiting, dressed in a faded carnival uniform, motionless. Still, but its eyes were on me, watching. I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The humming noise had faded, replaced by something worse, silence. A kind of unnatural, pressing silence that made my skin crawl. The figure didn't move, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it was waiting for me to go in. That whatever was inside wanted me to step forward. I turned, ready to run the other way, but the path behind me was gone. Where the exit had been, there was now only more carnival wood planks, stretching endlessly rows of old-fashioned carnival booths, each one draped in tattered red and white striped fabric. Some booths had games still set up: knock over the bottles, toss the rings, win a prize. Only there were no attendants. No people, just prizes, and the prizes, they were wrong. I took a slow step toward the nearest booth, my stomach twisting. The game was simple. A set of bottles stacked in a pyramid, waiting to be knocked down. But instead of plush toys or carnival trinkets, the shelf behind them was filled with something else. Jars, dozens of them, lined up neatly. Inside each jar, floating in thick amber liquid, were eyes, human eyes. All different shades, different sizes. Some were bloodshot. Some still had the faintest hint of life behind them, like they had been freshly taken. And beneath the jars, a faded sign read, "Knock down all 6 and win a new pair." I staggered back, horror crawling up my spine. My hands were trembling, my breath hitched in my throat. This place, this park, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was feeding. I turned my gaze to the other booths. My stomach twisted into tighter knots with each one I passed. A ring toss game, where the rings were severed fingers. A dart, throwing stall, but the targets were faces. Carved into rotting wood, each one eerily familiar. Each one someone I had seen in the park, and worse, some had been crossed out. As if they were gone, I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I needed to get out. I turned back to the ride's entrance, the clown's mouth still gaping, still grinning. The figure in front of it had moved. It was closer now, too close, and this time it was smiling. The hum returned, deep, vibrating, calling me forward. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a steady breath. I had two choices: stay here, surrounded by horrors I didn't understand, or step inside the ride, where something even worse was waiting for me. And yet, deep in my gut, I knew the truth. This park didn't care about my choices, because whatever I did, I was already playing its game. The figure was closer now, too close. It had been standing at the entrance of the ride still, silent, watching. But now, only a few feet separated us. Its uniform was a faded, old-fashioned carnival outfit, but its skin wasn't right. It looked stitched together, like someone had taken different pieces and sewn them into one body. The seams were rough, uneven, thick black thread holding the flesh together like a grotesque patchwork doll. The eyes weren't even the same color. One was an unnatural shade of pale blue, the other deep brown, both glassy, both lifeless. But the smile was real, stretched too wide, splitting open along the stitched seams, a grotesque, hungry grin. It lifted one arm, its sleeve tattered and frayed, and gestured toward the ride. "Step right up." the voice was wrong. It wasn't deep, nor was it high-pitched. It sounded like multiple voices at once, some male, some female, some impossibly distorted, all speaking in eerie unison. The words were stretched, unnatural, like they had been pulled from different mouths and forced together. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the wooden planks beneath me. The hum, the deep, vibrating hum, was growing louder. Not from the ride, not from the figure, but from inside me. A pulse, a vibration in my bones, like I was tuning into something that had been there all along. Step right up. The figure repeated, tilting its head. The seams along its neck tore open slightly, revealing raw muscle underneath. The sight jolted me back into my body. I turned and ran, not toward the ride, not toward the figure, just away, but the carnival had changed again. The booths, the game stalls, they were gone. In their place was something far worse. A corridor, no walls, no ceiling, just a long, endless stretch of wooden planks beneath my feet, flanked by mirrors. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, they lined both sides of the path, towering into the darkness above. Each one was different. Some were tall and thin, others wide and warped. Some had cracks spider webbing through the glass, distorting the reflections inside. And worst of all, they weren't just reflecting me. I slowed my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps. In the mirror to my right, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't doing what I was doing. I was standing still, but the reflection was moving. It turned its head before I did. It blinked when I didn't. And then, it smiled. A slow, knowing grin that stretched wider and wider, until the skin around the mouth split apart like torn fabric. I jerked back. My heart slammed against my ribs. I spun around to look at the mirror on my left. The reflection there was worse. It wasn't smiling. It was staring at something behind me. I felt my stomach drop. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through the floorboards, pressing against my skull, making my thoughts feel fuzzy. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I had to know what was standing behind me. I turned, and I wasn't alone. Another figure stood in the corridor, not the patchwork man. This one was different. It looked like me. Same height, same clothes, same face, but its eyes were gone. Just empty, gaping sockets staring back at me. And yet, somehow, I could still feel it looking at me. It lifted a hand, my hand, and then it stepped forward. The mirrors on both sides rippled, like the reflections were reacting, and then, in unison, they all reached out. Dozens of hands, dozens of versions of me. Some were grinning, some were screaming, some were missing pieces, eyes, lips, entire chunks of flesh. And all of them were moving toward me. I stumbled backward. I had to get out. I turned to run, but I collided with something solid. I gasped, staggering back. The patchwork man was there, close enough for me to see every single torn stitch, close enough for me to hear the whisper that wasn't coming from its mouth. It was coming from the mirrors. A chorus of voices, all mine, and they were whispering the same thing: "You've already been here before." The hum turned into a scream, a soundless, agonizing pressure in my head, my ribs, my skull. The mirrors shattered, and then darkness. Darkness swallowed me. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still standing, or if I had fallen. The weight of the world around me had vanished, replaced by an abyss so deep and vast that my senses struggled to keep up. Then, in the distance, a light. It was faint, flickering like a dying bulb, casting strange shadows against the void. I wasn't sure if I was moving toward it, or if it was pulling me in. The hum. The horrible hum had stopped. But something worse had replaced it. A voice, whispering, "You're almost home." The words were too close. Like they were being whispered right into my ear, though I felt no breath against my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the instant I did, something shifted. The light ahead exploded outward, stretching into long, flickering neon tubes. A jarring, mechanical clunk echoed through the void, and suddenly I wasn't standing in darkness anymore. I was in a hallway, no, Not a hallway, a funhouse. The walls were crooked, painted in faded reds and yellows, decorated with peeling murals of smiling clowns and hollow-eyed carnival characters. The floor beneath my feet wasn't solid. It felt unstable, shifting, as if the wood planks were breathing. I turned, the mirrors were gone. So was the patchwork man. I exhaled shakily. My heart was still hammering, my body trembling, but the eerie silence in the funhouse was almost calming. Almost, but then, footsteps, not mine. Something was here. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had all the time in the world. They echoed against the walls, bouncing off the warped surfaces, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. My throat tightened. I forced myself to move. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes the floor slanted down sharply, as if leading into a basement, but then just as suddenly sloped upward again. The ceiling bent inward, walls squeezing together, making the space feel suffocating. I kept walking, trying to find a way out, but no matter how many turns I took, the funhouse never ended. The footsteps continued, always just out of sight, always getting closer. Then a voice, soft, familiar. It sent a wave of ice through my veins. It was my own. This way. I froze. The words had come from somewhere ahead of me. A corner I hadn't turned yet. My stomach twisted, nausea rising in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run in the opposite direction, to get as far away as possible, but my feet had other ideas. I stepped forward, one step, then another. The hallway curved sharply, leading to a small, dimly lit alcove. A flickering light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting deep shadows on the walls, and standing beneath it, me. Not a reflection, not a mirror, it was me. Same clothes, same stance, same face, but there was something wrong. His eyes were hollow, not empty, not dark but glassy, like a doll's, and his smile. God, his smile, it was stretched too wide. Unnatural, like someone had carved it into his skin and forgotten to stop. He tilted his head, blinking slowly. Then he spoke, "You're almost home." The words sent a shockwave through my body. I stumbled back, but my other self stepped forward, matching my movement. I shook my head. No, this isn't real. But he just kept smiling, and then, in unison, the walls around us breathed. Not metaphorically, they inhaled. The wood expanded outward, the sound of shifting, groaning planks filling the space. The entire funhouse was alive, and I was standing inside its lungs. The floor lurched. I lost my balance, falling to my hands and knees as the walls contracted sharply. The air squeezed from my lungs, and my other self, the thing wearing my face, didn't move. He just watched. Smiling, the walls breathed in again. The space around me grew wider, looser, giving me just enough air to suck in a desperate breath. But the moment I did, it exhaled. The walls crashed inward. The last thing I saw was my own face, staring down at me. Still smiling, still whispering, "You're almost home." And then, everything collapsed. I woke up gasping. The air around me was thick, too thick. My lungs burned as I sucked in breath after breath, my body fighting against the overwhelming weight pressing down on me. For a moment, I thought I was buried alive, trapped under collapsed walls, swallowed whole by the funhouse. But when my eyes adjusted, I realized I was somewhere else, a ride. I was strapped into something cold, something metallic. My arms were pinned at my sides, heavy restraints locking me in place. The seat beneath me vibrated faintly, the hum of machinery just barely audible beneath the thick, choking silence. The smell hit me next. Rust, oil, damp wood. I turned my head. Rows of seats stretched outward in both directions, each one occupied by a figure. At first, I thought they were people. Then I realized they weren't breathing. They weren't moving. They weren't alive. They were mannequins, hundreds of them. Each one strapped in just like me, their heads tilted slightly forward, frozen in an eerie mockery of anticipation. Some had cracks running down their faces, their glass eyes dull and lifeless. Others had been stitched together patchwork things, made from multiple different bodies, pieces of different mannequins forced into one. And then the ride lurched forward. A deep, mechanical groan filled the air as the track ahead of us sloped upward. A roller coaster. I struggled against the restraints, my pulse hammering in my ears. The chain lift clanked and clanked, pulling us higher, inch by inch, the air growing thinner with each passing second. The mannequins remained silent, still, waiting. I turned, desperate to see where the track led, and my stomach dropped. There was no peak, no drop, no twist or turn. The track simply ended, a sheer cliff into nothingness. I thrashed, my muscles screaming as I tried to break free, but the restraints tightened. The ride continued its ascent, the void ahead yawning wider and wider, waiting to swallow us whole. Then something moved, not the mannequins, not the ride, something on the tracks, a figure, standing at the very edge. Watching, I couldn't see its face not yet, but it was tall, too tall. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, limbs long and wrong, stretched like a shadow against the sky. I knew it was waiting for me, and then, as if sensing my thoughts, it lifted an arm, not to wave, not to reach, to pull a lever. A sharp click echoed through the air, and the restraints released, not all at once. Just mine. The moment the last strap snapped open, the ride jerked forward. The mannequins, still locked in their seats, were pulled over the edge, plunging into the abyss, vanishing into the darkness below. I barely had time to react before the wind roared past me, sending me tumbling. I wasn't falling. I was floating, weightless, suspended in the air, caught between gravity and something else, something unnatural, and then I landed. Not on the ground, not on the ride, but somewhere else, somewhere impossible. The sky above me was wrong. The air was thick, humming with electricity, and ahead of me the Patchwork Man, standing in front of an exit sign. He grinned and whispered, "You're almost home." I didn't move. The Patchwork Man stood in front of the glowing exit sign, his body stitched together from pieces that didn't belong. His arms were slightly too long, his fingers ending in jagged, mismatched nails. His grin was too wide, stretching across his face like a carved jack-o'-lantern. And his eyes weren't his own. They flickered, shifting, changing. 1 second they were deep brown, the next icy blue, then green, then black, like someone was cycling through faces, trying to find the right one. I swallowed hard. Somehow I was alive. I had fallen from the roller coaster, yet I had landed without breaking a single bone. The ground beneath me felt soft but firm, like standing on a trampoline that wasn't bouncing. I forced myself to speak. "Where am I?" The Patchwork Man's grin didn't fade. "Almost home." His voice was wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Too slow, then too fast, then slowed again. I took a cautious step forward. My shoes made no sound. The ground absorbed it, like the world itself was swallowing every noise except for him. I glanced around. The exit sign was mounted above a tunnel, one that looked old, ancient, as if it had existed before the park itself. Its entrance was lined with rusted metal, the words "Employees Only" scratched onto the surface. A gust of wind blew past me, carrying a faint whisper. "Don't trust him." I froze. The whisper hadn't come from the Patchwork Man. It had come from behind me. Slowly I turned and nearly screamed. There were people standing in the distance. At least they looked like people. Shadows of them. Their faces were blurred, their edges flickering, like an image that wouldn't quite load. But their eyes were locked onto me, and all at once they started moving, not walking, not running. Gliding, sliding across the ground like they weren't bound by the rules of physics. Panic surged through my chest. I turned back to the Patchwork Man, but he was gone. The exit sign still glowed above the tunnel, but now the door beneath it was open, and something was waiting inside. I had two choices: stay and let the shadow, people reach me, or step into the tunnel and face whatever was inside. A sharp whisper hit my ears again. "Choose." I took a deep breath. and I ran into the tunnel. The tunnel swallowed me whole. As soon as I passed through the employee's only doorway, the world outside vanished. The air turned thick, humid, pressing against my skin like a living thing. The moment my foot touched the ground inside, I realized something was wrong. There was no echo, no sound of my hurried breath. No footsteps, no noise at all. The tunnel walls were curved, made of an old, decaying metal. The ceiling was just low enough that I felt the urge to duck. Strange markings lined the surface, scratches that looked intentional, like something had tried to write on the walls, but had done so in a language I couldn't understand. I ran my fingers over the indentations, expecting to feel rust or chipped paint, but instead they were smooth, like they had been carved into the metal from the inside. A low vibration hummed beneath my feet, a heartbeat. No, not mine. I turned, glancing over my shoulder. The entrance I had run through was gone. In its place was nothing but endless darkness stretching behind me, a void that seemed to move if I stared too long. I had no choice. I had to keep going forward. The tunnel stretched ahead, curving downward, leading deeper underground. A faint light flickered at the far end, not bright, but enough to cast long, dancing shadows across the tunnel walls. Then I heard it, whispers, soft, almost too quiet to notice at first, but as I walked they grew, layered voices, speaking over each other, some urgent, some calm, some laughing, some crying, and one voice, low and distant, calling my name. I froze. It was a voice I recognized, my own. I sucked in a sharp breath. I had to be imagining it. Maybe the stress, the fear. It was getting to me. But the moment I tried to push the thought away, the voice came again, louder, clearer. Come see. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. But the whispers continued, weaving through the air like invisible hands reaching for me, twisting around my thoughts. And then, up ahead, the tunnel opened into a room. I stepped inside. The floor wasn't solid. It looked like glass, but felt warm beneath my feet. I glanced down, and I nearly screamed. Bodies, lying beneath the glass floor, suspended in dark water. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, and they were looking up at me. Some were reaching, their hands pressed against the glass from below. Their mouths moved, mimicking the whispers I'd been hearing. One by one, their lips shaped the same words, "Come see." I staggered back. The walls of the room were covered in mirrors, but when I looked into them, I didn't see myself. I saw someone else. A boy, maybe 16, wearing an old theme park uniform, his name tag rusted over. His reflection stood perfectly still, but then, slowly, his lips curled into a smile. A familiar smile. I knew that face, but I had never seen it before. I had no memory of him, and yet he knew me. And then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was mine. The lights flickered, and the whispers stopped. I turned, but I wasn't alone anymore. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, unmoving, waiting. A single phrase scratched itself across the glass floor beneath my feet, written by no hand I could see. "No one leaves the park." And then, the floor began to crack. The glass beneath my feet groaned. A network of thin, jagged cracks spread outward, each splintering tendril racing toward the edges of the room. Below, the figures in the dark water shifted, their hands pressing harder against the glass, as if they were waiting for it to break, waiting for me to fall. I took a slow step back, my breath shaking, but the reflection in the mirror didn't move with me. He stayed still, watching, smiling. The tall figure in the doorway remained just as motionless, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, just the towering, unnatural stillness of something not human. "What do you want?" I forced the words out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. The boy in the mirror, however, did. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was mine, a perfect replica. I staggered backward, and the moment I did, the glass beneath my feet collapsed. The world tipped, and I fell, cold. The water swallowed me whole. It was deeper than I expected, far deeper. I thrashed, kicking upward, but something moved below me. A shape that was too large, too fluid, shifting just beyond the reach of the dim light filtering from above. I reached for the surface, but hands grabbed me. Dozens of pale, bloated arms, yanking at my clothes, pulling me down. I fought, but their grips were too strong. They weren't attacking me, they were holding me still, trapping me. And then I saw their faces, not strangers, not lost visitors. They were me, all of them. Hundreds of versions of me, their features distorted, mouths open in silent screams. And their eyes were wide with terror, because something was coming, something below us. The water grew darker, the pressure changed, an invisible force creeping up from the depths. I couldn't turn. I couldn't move, I could only feel it rising, and then I was yanked upward. A cold vice, like grip wrapped around my wrist, tearing me away from the hands dragging me into the abyss. I broke the surface, gasping, the air searing my lungs as I collapsed onto the floor. The glass had repaired itself, as if it had never broken, as if it had never been real. I turned onto my side, choking on the weight of my own breath. My clothes were dry. My body felt like it had never been in the water at all. But my wrist a handprint. Deep, bruised finger marks wrapped around my skin. Proof that something had touched me. And when I looked up, the boy in the mirror was still smiling. But now he was standing behind me, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, dozens of other figures stood in the reflection. Some were dressed in old park uniforms, some in regular clothes. Some looked like they had been here for decades rotting, their skin gray and stretched too tight over their bones. None of them moved, none of them blinked, but they were all looking at me. And then, in perfect unison, they tilted their heads. Like something had noticed me for the first time. The lights flickered, and the tunnel door creaked open. I wasn't alone in the room anymore. Something had stepped through, and it was waiting. I didn't move. Not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't. The door had swung open with an agonizing, deliberate creak, revealing a tunnel beyond it, bathed in flickering, pale yellow light. The air that drifted out was thick, humid, carrying the scent of something that had been rotting in the dark for years. And in that doorway, something was standing there. The shadows made it impossible to see its face, but its silhouette was wrong. Tall, too tall. Its shoulders sloped unnaturally, its arms long, hanging just past its knees. I could make out fingers, thin, unnatural, twitching at its sides as if resisting the urge to reach out. And the worst part, it was breathing, deep, ragged, the kind of breath you hear from something trying to be quiet, but failing. Behind me, the mirror still reflected those unmoving figures. The boy who wore my face, the decayed park employees, the silent visitors. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, at the thing in the tunnel, and then they all smiled. I ran, my feet slammed against the floor as I sprinted toward the only exit I knew, back the way I had come. I didn't care where it led. I didn't care if I got lost. I just needed to be anywhere but here. The thing in the tunnel didn't chase me. Not yet, but I could feel it watching. I turned a corner, nearly colliding with a row of rusted turnstiles. There was an exit sign above them, blinking erratically. A way out, no. I had seen this place before. This was the same entrance I had used to come in. Somehow, I had circled back, and the door it was still locked. I slammed my fists against it, my pulse hammering. The air around me felt heavier, pressing in on my chest. I turned back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and the hallway I had just run through wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood there now, a sea of motionless silhouettes, their faces hidden in shadow, and they were waiting. I took a step back, pressing myself against the locked door. My fingers scrambled over the metal, desperately searching for a handle, a latch, anything. But then one of them moved, a single figure, stepping forward from the rest. I recognized him immediately. The park security guard, the same one who had stopped me at the gates. His uniform was pristine now, the name tag still gleaming against his chest. But something about his face was wrong. His eyes, They were completely black, and when he smiled, his lips pulled back too wide. Like his mouth had been cut at the edges, stretched into something impossibly unnatural. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice wasn't his own. It was layered, distorted like multiple voices speaking at once. And then, as if responding to his words, the park came alive. Music, the sound of it rushed through the air, bouncing off the walls, swelling in volume. Not the upbeat, cheerful jingles you'd expect. No, this was something else. Something warped. It started slow notes bending, distorting. A record playing at the wrong speed. A broken melody that seemed to unravel the longer it played. And then the lights flickered, not just in the hallway, all around me. I could hear it now, rides clanking to life in the distance, engines humming, gears grinding. The whole park was waking up, and I was trapped inside. The security guard took another step forward. So did the others. I had one choice, one chance. I turned and ran straight into the park. The sound of laughter filled the air. But it wasn't real. It came from the speakers, from nowhere. The kind of canned laughter you'd hear in a sitcom, played at the wrong speed, too slow, too unnatural. I ran past stalls, past darkened rides, past shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. Grabbed my wrist. I screamed, a hand, cold, clammy. I spun, ready to fight, ready to tear myself away, and stopped. It wasn't the security guard. It wasn't one of the figures. It was a girl, a real person. Her grip was tight, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't let them catch you," she gasped. And then, without another word, she dragged me into the shadows. I stumbled forward as the girl yanked me into the darkness. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I could still hear the laughter, warped, broken, stretching through the air like a slow, distorted recording. But now it felt farther away. We ducked behind a row of abandoned game stalls, hidden in the deep shadows between the neon lights. The girl finally let go of my wrist, pressing a finger to her lips. I stared at her, still trying to catch my breath. She looked like she had been here a long time. Her clothes were faded, torn in places. Her hair was messy, her face smudged with dirt. But her eyes were sharp, focused. She looked at me like she already knew everything about me. Like she had been waiting for me. Before I could ask who she was, she whispered, "They're looking for you." A chill ran down my spine. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she motioned for me to follow and slipped deeper into the darkness. I hesitated. Something about her felt off, but I didn't have a choice, because if I stayed here, I wasn't just afraid of being caught. I was afraid of what would happen if I was. We moved silently through the shadows, weaving between old, dust-covered attractions and empty food carts. The sounds of the park echoed around us. Rides clanking to life, gears grinding, music playing from unseen speakers. But something was different now. The voices were getting closer. They weren't speaking, they were whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs, hissing through the air like something slithering just out of sight. I shuddered. "Where are we going?" I whispered. The girl didn't answer, not at first. She just kept moving, her footsteps silent against the cracked pavement. Then, somewhere safe. I wanted to believe her, but in this place, I didn't think anywhere was safe. We reached an old funhouse. The entrance was a wide, gaping mouth, frozen in a manic, toothy grin. The paint was peeling, the colors faded. A single light bulb flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. The girl turned to me, her expression serious. Inside, now, I hesitated. Everything in me was screaming that this was a bad idea. But then I heard it, a sound that sent a bolt of ice, cold terror down my spine. Footsteps, not just one pair, dozens, moving in unison, getting closer. I didn't have time to think. I rushed inside. The door slammed shut behind us, muffling the sound of the outside world. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. I took a step forward, my shoes scuffing against the floor. The dim light overhead flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. And then a voice, soft, mechanical, "Welcome to the House of Fun." The walls shuddered, lights flashed to life. Mirrors lined the room, tall, warped, reflecting versions of me that weren't quite right. I stared at them, unease creeping into my gut. In one reflection, I had no eyes. In another, my mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. In another, I wasn't there at all. I turned to the girl. "What is this place?" She didn't look at me. She was staring at one of the mirrors, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. I followed her gaze. My blood turned to ice, because the mirror in front of us, it wasn't reflecting us. It was showing something else, something moving, something watching us, and then it stepped forward. Right out of the glass, the figure stepped out of the mirror, not like a normal person stepping through a door, way it melted through. Its body poured out, like liquid shadow, solidifying into something human, shaped but not human. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back. The girl beside me was frozen, her wide eyes locked onto the thing standing before us. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms hanging just a little too long. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth expanse of skin where a face should have been. But I knew it could see me. I could feel it. The air around us thickened, like the room itself was closing in. The dim lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And then it moved, not by walking, it glided. 1 second it was a few feet away, the next, it was inches from my face. A noise crawled through the room, a whisper, not from the creature, from the mirrors. I turned my head slightly, catching glimpses of movement in the warped glass. Reflections of things that weren't there, twisting figures, faces that weren't ours, shapes skittering across the surface like insects under glass. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The girl beside me suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. We tore through the funhouse, twisting through narrow hallways lined with endless reflections. But something was wrong. The mirrors weren't just reflecting us anymore. They were changing. In one, I saw myself grinning ear to ear, my mouth stretching too wide, my teeth sharpening like a row of tiny knives. In another, I saw my own back, as if something was behind me, something reaching out. I didn't look over my shoulder. I just ran. We burst into another room, a long corridor lined with distorted funhouse mirrors. The lights overhead buzzed, flickering in and out. The girl skidded to a stop, gripping my arm. She turned to me, eyes sharp. "They don't like being seen." I swallowed hard. "What?" She nodded toward the mirrors. "Don't turn away. Don't blink. As long as you're looking, they won't move." I didn't ask who they were, because I already knew. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared into the nearest mirror. Something was inside. A dark shape, hunched with long fingers pressed against the glass, not moving, not yet. I forced myself to keep my eyes open. The girl started backing up, never breaking eye contact with her own reflection. I did the same. The air in the corridor felt wrong, like it was pressing down on me, heavy with something unseen. And then a flicker. The lights overhead blinked out for half a second, just long enough for the thing in the mirror to move. It was closer now, pressed against the glass, its faceless head tilted, almost curious. The light came back, and I realized something horrifying. The glass had cracked. A thin, jagged fracture spread across the surface, like something had pushed too hard against the other side. They were trying to get out. We kept moving, step by step, never looking away. My eyes burned, my vision blurring from the effort. The end of the corridor was just ahead, a door, slightly open, a faint glow coming from beyond it, almost there. Almost the lights cut out completely. I gasped. The room plunged into absolute darkness, and in the dark, I heard them move. A rush of scraping, shifting bodies. The mirrors creaked, the glass straining. I knew what would happen if I stood still. So I ran. We crashed through the door at full speed, tumbling into another room. A different kind of light flooded over us. Not the sickly flickering of the funhouse. Neon, bright, flashing, oversaturated. I blinked rapidly, my eyes adjusting to the sudden glow. And then I realized where we were, a midway, but not like the one outside. This one was full of people. I turned in a slow circle, my chest heaving. Carnival booths stretched in every direction. Barkers shouted from their stands, calling out to customers. Rides whirled in the distance, lights spinning in hypnotic patterns. It looked normal, almost, but something felt wrong. Then I noticed the girl beside me. She was staring. Her face had gone pale, her hands clenched into fists. I followed her gaze, my blood turned to ice, because the people around us, they weren't moving right. They walked, they laughed, they played games, but every motion was too smooth, too synchronized, like puppets on invisible strings. And then, as one, they all turned to look at us. The crowd stared at us, not in the way people normally do. No confusion, no curiosity, no emotion. Just blank, synchronized attention. 100 pairs of eyes, all locked onto us at the exact same time. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. The girl beside me didn't move. I could hear her breathing, fast, shallow. Neither of us spoke, and then, just as suddenly as they'd turned, they smiled, all of them, the same exact way. Wide, stretched too wide. My stomach lurched, because it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. Their mouths pulled back too far, their teeth too white, too perfect. Their lips curled in a way that seemed practiced, like they were mimicking something. I took a step back. And they stepped forward, all of them, in perfect unison. The sound of their footsteps wasn't natural. It wasn't the shuffling of a crowd. It was one sound, a single, synchronized step. The girl grabbed my arm. "We have to go," she whispered. I didn't need convincing. We turned and ran. We weaved through the carnival stands, past rows of pristine, untouched game booths. Knock over the milk bottles, win a goldfish, test your strength, but no one was playing. The booths were staffed, but the workers just stood there, smiling, identical expressions, frozen in place. And then, as we passed, their heads turned to follow us. Not their bodies, just their heads. A slow, mechanical motion. My pulse pounded in my ears. We reached an intersection, the midway splitting in 4 different directions. I skidded to a stop, trying to catch my breath. Where do we go? The girl was looking around frantically. And then her eyes landed on something. A sign. Exit right arrow. It hung over a wide pathway, leading toward what looked like the edge of the park. For the first time, I felt hope. We sprinted toward it, our footsteps pounding against the pavement. The crowd didn't follow, but I could still feel their eyes, watching, waiting, as if they already knew something we didn't. We reached the exit gate, and for a brief, glorious second, I thought we were safe. But then I noticed something strange. The turnstiles weren't turning, they were locked in place. The exit booth was empty, and beyond the gate there was nothing. I don't mean it was dark or foggy or hidden. I mean nothing, just a vast, empty space, like the world simply stopped existing past this point. I took a step closer, my stomach twisted, because looking at it felt wrong, like my brain refused to process it, as if my mind knew something was missing. The girl beside me let out a shaky breath. "This isn't real." I turned to her. "What?" She swallowed hard. "This place, this park, it's not real." I wanted to argue. Of course it was real. I could feel the ground beneath me. I could smell the faint scent of popcorn and fried dough. But when I looked back at that empty space, I wasn't so sure anymore. Then, behind us, the music started again, loud, cheerful. The lights brightened, flickering wildly. And a voice rang out over the loudspeakers, "Welcome to Midnight Carnival. The fun never ends, and neither do our guests." The girl grabbed my wrist. "We need to hide," she hissed. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. The crowd was moving again, slowly, deliberately, still smiling, still perfectly synchronized. The sound of their steps echoed through the air. Click, click, click. No rush, no running, because they didn't need to. They already knew we weren't leaving. We took off in the opposite direction, tearing through the midway, past the booths, past the rides, past the watching eyes. We turned a corner and suddenly, everything changed. The bright lights flickered. The colors drained from the world. The cheerful music slowed, warping into something distorted. And the people, they stopped moving. Just froze, like dolls waiting to be played with. The only sound now was our own breathing. And in that awful silence, the girl turned to me. Her voice barely a whisper. I don't think we're in the park anymore. The silence was worse than the noise. Before, at least, there had been sound music, laughter, the distant hum of machinery. But now, nothing. Just us, standing in the middle of a carnival that felt wrong. The colors had drained from everything. What was once bright red and gold was now a dull, lifeless shade of gray. The neon lights overhead flickered weakly, their glow barely illuminating the empty pathways. And the people, if they were even people, had stopped moving. Their frozen faces were still twisted into those unnatural smiles. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. What just happened? The girl beside me, the only other real person here, as far as I could tell, shook her head. I don't know, but I think, she hesitated. I turned to her. Think what? She exhaled. I think we stepped into another part of the park. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. Another part of the park, as if this place was bigger than we'd realized, as if it was changing around us. I looked around, my stomach knotting. The midway stretched on, empty stalls and darkened rides looming in the distance. It felt endless, like no matter how far we ran, we'd never find the edge. I took a slow step forward. My foot made no sound against the pavement. The ground was soft, not like dirt or sand, but something else entirely. I bent down, pressing my fingers to the ground, and jerked my hand back. It wasn't pavement. It felt like fabric. Like we were standing on something that wasn't real. I looked up at the girl, my voice barely a whisper. This place isn't solid. She nodded slowly. I know. We moved cautiously, weaving through the stalls and broken rides, our footsteps eerily muffled by the strange ground beneath us. Everything was abandoned. The Ferris wheel, once glowing and full of life, now loomed in the distance, its carriages swaying without wind. The bumper cars were still, the metal frames covered in a thin layer of something dark, and the carousel. It had stopped. The horses stood frozen, their painted eyes watching us. I shuddered. Every step forward felt wrong, like we were walking deeper into something we weren't supposed to see. And then, finally, we saw him. A figure stood in the middle of the path ahead, not moving, not smiling. Just standing, watching. He wasn't like the others. His clothes were old, too old. A faded carnival uniform, the fabric worn thin, stained with something that looked too dark to be dirt. His face was obscured by shadow, but his eyes, they glowed, not like light, but like something reflecting light that wasn't there. The girl beside me grabbed my wrist, her grip tight. We need to turn around. The man tilted his head. Not a normal movement, too sharp, too sudden. Then he took a step forward. I turned to run and crashed into something solid. I gasped, stumbling backward. The girl let out a strangled sound of shock, because the path behind us. It was gone. The carnival booths, the midway, everything had disappeared, replaced by a tall, solid wall. We were trapped. The man took another step toward us. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding hard against my ribs. He opened his mouth and spoke. His voice was wrong. Not deep, not high, just empty. You shouldn't be here. My throat went dry. The girl was shaking beside me. We didn't mean to be. The man tilted his head the other way, slowly. Too slowly. You need to leave. I let out a weak laugh, despite the fear clawing at my chest. We'd love to, but we don't know how. He blinked. Once, deliberately. Then, he raised a hand and pointed. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Just the endless, empty carnival stretching on forever. But then I saw it. A door. Not a gate, not an archway. An actual door. Standing alone in the middle of the path, as if it had always been there. The girl grabbed my arm, that wasn't there before. I swallowed hard. I know. The man slowly lowered his hand. His expression never changed. He didn't blink again, didn't move. Just watched us, like he was waiting. The girl took a shaky breath. Do we go through it? I stared at the door. Something deep in my gut screamed not to. But staying here wasn't an option, not with him, not with whatever else might be watching. I exhaled sharply. We don't have a choice. And with that, we took a step forward toward the door. Toward whatever waited on the other side. The door stood alone in the middle of the carnival path. It wasn't attached to anything. No walls, no structure. Just a single wooden doorframe planted into the ground. It didn't belong here, but then again, neither did we. The man in the faded carnival uniform hadn't moved. He still stood in the same spot, his hollow eyes locked onto us. The glow in them never flickered, never wavered. And he was waiting for us to step through. The girl beside me squeezed my wrist. Her hand was ice cold. We don't have to go through it. I swallowed, staring at the door. Then what do we do? She hesitated. Because there was no other way out. The carnival behind us had vanished. There were no pathways, no rides, just an unbroken, solid wall that hadn't been there before. It was as if the park was shifting, closing in around us. My pulse pounded in my ears. We had to move. Had to do something, because I was suddenly sure of one thing. If we stayed here too long, we'd become part of this place. Just like the others, just like him. I turned to her. We have to go through. She exhaled sharply, nodding. Okay. Together, we stepped forward and reached for the door. The moment my fingers brushed the handle, everything changed. The air grew heavy, thick, like we were standing in the middle of a storm that hadn't hit yet. The lights overhead dimmed. And then we heard the music, faint at first. A slow, warped calliope tune that crawled under my skin. It was coming from the other side of the door. A deep, distant sound, like an old record playing at half speed. I turned to the girl. She was shaking. It's waiting for us. I didn't want to ask what it was. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and beyond it was another carnival, but not the one we had just been in, no. This one was older. The rides were rusted, their paint peeling. The ground beneath us wasn't pavement, but dirt. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. And the worst part, there were people here, but not like the frozen figures we had seen before. These people moved, laughed, walked between the rides, but something was off. Their clothes were old, decades old. The men wore suspenders and high-waisted trousers. The women had curled hair and long skirts, like we had stepped into a carnival from the 1950s. But this wasn't a memory, this was real. I turned to the girl beside me, whispering, "What is this?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Then we heard it, a voice, not from the people walking around, no, from behind us, from the man in the faded carnival uniform. He was inside the door now, standing right behind us, and he whispered, his breath cold against my skin, "Welcome back." The words slithered into my ears like something alive. I turned sharply, but the man in the faded carnival uniform was already gone. The door stood open behind us, the world we had left behind still visible through the frame. But something in my gut told me the moment we stepped forward, that door would vanish. We were in their world now. And the people around us, they hadn't noticed us yet. They laughed, moved, chatted in soft voices, everything looked normal. But it wasn't. I could feel it in my bones. The air was thicker here. The sky above was an unnatural shade of deep blue, like the sun had never fully set, but never truly rose, either. The lights on the rides were dim, flickering, like they were running on borrowed energy, and then I saw it. A woman at a ticket booth. She was selling admissions. Her uniform was pristine, but her face wasn't right. Her features were too still, too perfect, like a doll's. She didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. But when her lips finally parted, her voice was smooth, unnatural. Step right up, step right up. The carnival awaits you. The girl beside me gripped my arm. She had seen it too. I whispered, "What is this place?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think we should stay long." We moved forward cautiously, weaving through the crowd. The people around us didn't seem to acknowledge our presence, and that was worse somehow, because I wasn't sure they were real. Their movements felt too rehearsed, too predictable, like they were on a loop. I watched as a man in a bowler hat leaned over a cotton candy stand, handed a paper cone to a little girl in a checkered dress. Then, just seconds later, he did it again. The exact same movement, the same hand gesture, the same polite chuckle, like a tape was playing, repeating the same few seconds over and over again. I swallowed hard. This wasn't real, this wasn't real. But then something broke the loop, a sound, a deep, distorted bell, loud enough to rattle my skull, and suddenly everything stopped. The people froze in place. Even the lights on the carnival rides dimmed, flickering weakly. And then, in perfect, horrifying unison, they turned toward us. Not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with recognition, like they knew exactly who we were. The girl beside me inhaled sharply. "Run." We bolted. We didn't know where to go, but we ran anyway, past the frozen faces, past the silent booths, past the empty ticket stands. The world around us felt like it was closing in, and behind us we heard something move, not footsteps, not voices, something deeper, something inhuman. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running. Ahead, a carousel spun slowly. Its wooden horses rocked up and down, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light, and at its center a figure stood, watching us, waiting. And for the first time since we arrived in this impossible place, I felt something colder than fear. Recognition, because even from a distance I knew exactly who it was, and I knew I had seen them before. The figure on the carousel did not move, but I could feel their eyes on me, not just watching, waiting. The carousel's eerie tune droned on, mechanical and warped, its painted horses rising and falling in slow, hypnotic motions. The air smelled of old grease and something faintly metallic. The girl beside me, her breath was unsteady. I could feel her hesitation, the slight tremor in her grip on my arm. She saw them too, and she knew, just like I did, this wasn't the first time. I had seen them before, but where? The figure was standing in the very center of the carousel, hidden in the shadows, their form blurred by the flashing carnival lights. I tried to make out their features, but something about them was wrong. Their face shifted. It was subtle, like a flicker of an image on an old television screen. 1 second, their features were familiar. The next, they were someone else entirely, and then the carousel stopped. The music cut off in the middle of a note, leaving behind a deafening silence, and in that silence they moved. Not the way a person moves, not with hesitation, not with weight. They glided. 1 second, they were on the carousel platform. The next, they were in front of me. A breath caught in my throat. They were too close. Their face, I knew it. But the moment I tried to grasp the memory, it slipped away, like trying to hold water in my hands. Their lips parted, and a voice that was both mine and not mine came from their mouth. "You shouldn't be here." The girl beside me whimpered. She took a step back, pulling me with her, but my feet felt rooted in place. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. The words stuck, tangled in the fear gripping my chest. The figure took another step forward, closer. Their face kept shifting, blurring, like they were trying to decide who to be. Their mouth opened again, but this time I heard my own voice. "You've been here before." The words sent a chill down my spine, because deep down I knew they were true. The air around us felt heavy, pressing against my skin. The lights flickered violently, the entire carnival groaning like something alive. The figures in the crowd, those strange, silent people trapped in their repeating loops, had stopped moving entirely. They were all facing us, watching, waiting. I turned back to the figure in front of me, my breath shallow. And then they reached for me. Their hand was ice, cold when it touched my arm, and in an instant I was somewhere else. The carnival was gone. The music, the lights, the unnatural sky. All of it vanished. I was standing in an empty room. No doors, no windows, only a single mirror in front of me. And in the reflection I saw them, standing behind me. Smiling, their face was no longer shifting, because now they were me. I couldn't breathe. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just similar to me. It was me. Every detail was perfect. Same hair, same eyes, same clothes, except the smile. It was wrong, too wide, too sharp, like something wearing my face but not quite knowing how to use it. Behind the glass, they tilted their head, studying me. And then they moved, not me, them. Their hand lifted in a slow, deliberate motion. My own hand stayed still. That wasn't a reflection, it was something else. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. There were no doors, no windows, only the mirror. I turned, my hands pressing against the walls, cold, smooth, solid, trapped. Where am I? My voice was barely more than a whisper. The figure in the mirror didn't answer, but their smile widened. And then they spoke. You already know. A sharp ringing filled my ears. Memories fractured, disjointed flashed through my mind. The carousel, the shifting faces, the endless carnival that never closed, and the feeling, the undeniable, gut-wrenching feeling that I had been here before. But how, when? I turned back to the mirror, my reflection standing perfectly still, eyes locked on mine. And then their lips moved, but the voice wasn't theirs, it was mine. Look closer. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to look, but something inside me, the same horrible, gnawing curiosity that had led me into this nightmare in the first place, forced me forward. I stepped closer, and as I did the mirror changed. The surface rippled like water. The reflection wavered, distorting, and then, suddenly, I wasn't looking at myself anymore. I was looking at something else, a memory, the carnival, but not the one I had just left. This one was different. The lights were dimmer, the air thick with fog. The rides were older, rusted with time. The sound of distant laughter echoed through the empty pathways, unnatural and distorted. And then I saw him, a man standing in the center of it all, tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shifting lights. But there was something deeply familiar about him. I knew him. I had seen him before. And then the memory shifted. The man turned, and for the first time I saw his face. My heart stopped, because I wasn't looking at a stranger. I was looking at myself. The mirror shattered. A violent crack split across its surface, spider, webbing outward in jagged lines. I stumbled back as shards of glass began to rain down, dissolving before they could hit the ground. The reflection, the other me, was still smiling, unmoving, and then the glass was gone. The mirror was no longer a mirror. It was a doorway, and the figure in the reflection stepped through. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. They took a step forward, closing the space between us. Their voice was soft, almost reassuring. It's time to remember. And before I could react, their hand pressed against my forehead. A flood of memories rushed in, memories I had forgotten, memories I had buried. The truth I had been running from. And as it all came crashing down, I finally understood. I had never left the carnival. I had always been here. And I would never leave. The weight of the realization crushed me. I had never left the carnival. I had always been here. But how? Why? The figure in front of me, the one wearing my face, lowered their hand from my forehead, their expression eerily calm. The memories they had just forced into my mind swirled and clashed, breaking apart before I could fully grasp them. It was like trying to hold water in my hands, the images slipping through my fingers before I could make sense of them. I staggered back, shaking my head. No, that's not true. The other me, or whatever it was, tilted its head. Then tell me, when was the last time you left? My mouth opened, but no answer came. My breath hitched. I tried to think back, to trace my steps before entering the carnival, the road, the highway stretching into darkness, the flashing neon sign welcoming me in, and before that, I couldn't remember. My hands trembled. The thought dug into me like claws. This wasn't just forgetfulness. Something had taken my memories, erased them, my entire life before this moment. It was gone. I turned sharply, searching the endless hall of mirrors for an escape. The reflections mimicked my panic, thousands of versions of myself staring back. Why? Died desperate. And then they didn't. One by one, the reflections stopped moving. Their heads snapped toward me at unnatural angles, their smiles growing wider, too wide. Grins stretching beyond human limits. Their mouths opened in unison, and they all spoke together. You were never supposed to remember. The words reverberated through the air, twisting into something not quite human. The room shuddered. The mirrors began to crack, run. The instinct slammed into me with such force that I obeyed without thinking. I turned and bolted, my footsteps pounding against the endless black floor. The glass shattered behind me, a deafening cascading wave of breaking reflections. But the pieces didn't fall, they rose, sharp shards twisting in midair, swirling like a storm of jagged teeth, chasing me down the corridor. A mirror ahead of me flickered, and something stepped out. A figure, not me, not human, tall, its limbs impossibly long, its face obscured in shadow. But I could feel its eyes, watching, waiting, and then it reached for me. I veered left, nearly crashing through another mirror. The glass rippled like liquid, and suddenly I wasn't in the hall anymore. I was somewhere else, the Ferris wheel. But it wasn't how I remembered it. The lights were too dim, the air too heavy. The gondolas creaked, swaying without wind. And as I stood there, panting, heart hammering in my chest, I realized I wasn't alone. Someone was already sitting in the nearest gondola. Watching me, I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my legs shaking. And when I finally saw their face, the ground lurched beneath me. Because it wasn't a stranger, it was me, but not just another reflection. This version of me was older. Worn, eyes hollow, dark circles carved beneath them. Their expression was blank, empty, until suddenly, it wasn't. They leaned forward, gripping the rusted safety bar, and they whispered 3 words that sent ice down my spine. You have to run. I couldn't move. The older version of me sat in the rusted gondola, his hollow eyes locked onto mine, the dim glow of the Ferris wheel lights casting eerie shadows across his face. You have to run, he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. From what? His fingers curled tightly around the safety bar. From yourself. A loud clunk echoed through the air. The Ferris wheel jerked to life. The gondolas creaked as they began to rotate, slow and unsteady. The entire structure trembled, groaning under its own weight as if it had been asleep for decades and was only now waking up. I took a step back. Something was wrong. The air felt thicker, the night itself pressing in on me, suffocating. The lights above flickered, casting everything in brief bursts of neon red and deep violet. Shadows stretched unnaturally, shifting, twisting. And then I saw them, figures standing just beyond the ride, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Their shapes were indistinct, more like silhouettes than people, their features hidden in darkness. But even without seeing their faces, I felt their eyes. A sudden shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to the Ferris wheel. The older version of me was still staring, but something had changed. His lips had curled into a small, sad smile. He wasn't warning me anymore. He was accepting something I didn't understand yet. And then, with slow, deliberate movements, he raised his hand. Not to wave, not to beckon me forward, but to point behind me. I didn't want to look. I knew what that meant. It meant there was something there, something I wasn't ready to see, but I had no choice. My body moved on its own, my breath shuddering as I turned. And there, just beyond the flickering carnival lights, a figure, not like the ones standing in the shadows. Not like anything I had seen before. It was taller than any human should be, its form elongated, stretched, unnatural. A thin grin carved across its face, too wide, too sharp. Its fingers, long, bony, wrong, twitched at its sides. And its eyes were mine. The breath caught in my throat. My legs screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The figure tilted its head, observing me with something too intelligent, too knowing. And then it took a step forward. The entire carnival lurched, like reality itself had glitched. The lights blinked out. For a moment, I was in complete darkness. And then a voice, whispering, so close to my ear it sent ice through my veins, "You are almost ready." I gasped, and suddenly the lights snapped back on. I was somewhere else. No Ferris wheel, no figures, just a mirror. A single, full-length mirror standing in the middle of the carnival path. And in the reflection, not just me, the thing wearing my face, smiling, waiting. The mirror stood in front of me, its surface rippling like water, disturbed by a single touch. My own reflection stared back, but it was wrong not just in expression, but in presence. It smiled, but I didn't. It blinked, but I hadn't. And then, with slow, deliberate motion, it stepped forward. I staggered back, heart pounding against my ribs. The reflection wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real. A second me, stepping out of the mirror, its form shifting as it peeled itself from the glass. The sound was sickening, like wet skin tearing away from something it had fused to. And then, as it fully emerged, the mirror shattered behind it. The shards hung in the air, frozen in time for just a moment before vanishing into nothingness. The thing wearing my face stood still. It tilted its head, examining me with my own eyes. I took another step back. It mirrored me, a perfect, unnatural mimicry. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak it did first. My own voice, but distorted. Slower, deeper. "You left the gate open." I swallowed hard. "What gate?" It smiled wider, "The one you should have never walked through." The carnival lights flickered overhead, bathing the park in waves of eerie red and gold. I could hear the distant hum of rides still running, empty roller coasters screeching on rusted tracks, carousels spinning without riders, calliope music playing in slow, distorted tones. But in this moment, none of it mattered, because the thing that had stepped out of the mirror, it wasn't just copying me anymore. It was moving toward me, and I couldn't run. My legs refused to move, as if the ground itself had decided I belonged here. The thing reached out a hand, my hand, and placed it on my chest. A sharp, searing pain erupted where it touched, like fire spreading under my skin, like something being peeled away from my soul. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to replace me. I forced my body to move, tearing myself away from its grip, stumbling backward. My vision blurred, my breath coming in shallow, gasping draws. But then I noticed something. The thing winced. For the first time, it hesitated. I looked down at my chest where it had touched me. There was no mark, no wound, but I felt something there, a warmth, a memory, and suddenly I understood. This thing could mimic me. It could become me, but it couldn't take what I remembered. It couldn't steal my past. That was the difference between it and me. I forced myself to focus on every moment that made me me. The park when it was still open, the smell of popcorn and fried dough. The first time I rode the Ferris wheel with my father, the laughter, the warmth, the realness, the thing jerked back as if burned. I took a step forward. For the first time, it was the one retreating. I gritted my teeth. "You are not me." The thing's grin faltered. The ground trembled, and somewhere in the distance, a voice whispered, "You should not have remembered." The world around me shifted. The park tilted, the structures warping, twisting, unraveling. Everything was breaking apart, because I had done something I wasn't supposed to do. I had remembered the truth, and now the park wanted me gone. The ground trembled beneath me, shifting like a living thing. The rides screeched in protest, the calliope music groaning as if the park itself had become aware of my defiance. The mirror version of me stood frozen, its grin now twisted into something unnatural. It wasn't mimicking anymore, it was watching. Waiting, something in the air had changed, and then the sky split open, not with lightning, not with sound, but with emptiness, a dark, yawning rift, stretching across the sky like a crack in reality itself. And through that crack, I saw something, the real theme park, the way it had been, the way it was supposed to be. For a moment, the illusion faltered. The rusted, rotting rides flickered, flashing into pristine, gleaming attractions, vibrant and full of life. I saw the carousel spinning, its golden horses untouched by time. The roller coaster soared, its tracks not crumbling, but smooth and strong. The echoes of laughter filled the air, not the distorted, nightmarish sounds that had haunted me. Real laughter. Voices I recognized. I saw my father, standing at the entrance, waving to me, and in that instant, I knew the park wasn't supposed to be like this. Something had trapped it, something had changed it, and if I could just know. The voice slithered through the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The ground buckled, the crack in the sky began to close, the park was fighting back. I turned toward the mirror version of myself. It was no longer smiling. Its body had shifted, warped, elongated, turning into something that wasn't human anymore. It stepped forward, the air around it distorting, as if reality itself was trying to reject its presence. You don't belong outside. The words weren't a warning, they were a sentence, a judgment. It raised a hand, my hand, and pointed at me. And suddenly the park began to pull me in. The world tilted, the asphalt beneath my feet becoming quicksand. I scrambled, trying to move, but the air itself had weight, pressing down on me, dragging me toward the center of the park. The Ferris wheel screeched, its rusted metal twisting as it spun in reverse. The carousel shuddered, its once majestic horses contorting into monstrous figures, their eyes glowing with something ancient. And the people, the ones I had seen trapped in the park, they were watching, standing at the edges of the rides, their faces blank, their eyes hollow, waiting not for me to escape, but for me to join them. I dug my fingers into the pavement, trying to hold on, trying to fight against whatever force was dragging me deeper. But then I felt it, a hand gripping my wrist, pulling me backward. I turned, heart hammering, and there, standing behind me, was her. The girl from the House of Mirrors, the girl who had whispered, "They can't see us if we don't move." She looked different now, stronger, more solid, more real. Her grip on my wrist tightened, and then she whispered, "You have to let go of the park." The words sent a jolt through me. Let go. I looked around, the nightmare version of the park looming over me, twisting, writhing. And then I looked up at the crack in the sky. It was almost gone, almost sealed shut, my one way out. I had seconds to decide. Stay and become part of whatever this place had become, or let go of whatever was keeping me here. I closed my eyes. I thought of my father's voice. I thought of the way the park used to be. And then I let go, and the world collapsed. The moment I let go, the world shattered. Not in an explosion of light, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, creeping dissolution. The colors bled from the rides, dripping away like watercolors running down a canvas. The sky melted from its deep, unnatural red into a blank, unrecognizable void. And the ground beneath me, it stopped pulling. For the first time, the park felt still. I turned to the girl, still gripping my wrist. She exhaled sharply, her face pale, her eyes locked onto something behind me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned and saw it, the mirror version of me, only it wasn't me anymore. It had lost all semblance of human form. Its features had stretched, its body warped and jagged, as if something had taken a rough sketch of my outline and tried to fill it in wrong. Its grin was still there, too wide, too knowing, but its eyes, they weren't mirrors anymore. They were holes, deep, dark voids, and they were hungry. You can't leave. The voice came from everywhere, not just the twisted reflection standing before me, but from the very fabric of the park itself. The rides creaked in unison, the carousel lurched, the Ferris wheel moaned as if it, too, was speaking. The park was alive, and it was angry. The girl beside me tightened her grip. "We have to move," she whispered. I didn't argue, we ran. The ground beneath us was unstable, shifting like sand, like liquid. The rides blurred past us, their shapes flickering, trying to decide what they were. One moment, I was running past a game booth, its prizes staring at me with empty, unblinking eyes. The next, it had collapsed into darkness, a gaping hole where it used to be. The park was losing its grip on itself, and yet I could feel it. The thing behind me wasn't giving up. It was chasing us. The sound of something sharp scraping the pavement filled the air. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The reflection wasn't running, it was gliding, its limbs barely moving, its body shifting forward in unnatural jerks. And its mouth, it was moving now, repeating something over and over. "You can't leave, you can't leave, you can't leave." The words echoed in my head, slamming against the walls of my mind like a bell tolling in the distance. The girl yanked me forward. "Don't listen," she shouted. "We're almost there." Almost where, I wanted to ask. But then I saw it, the exit gate. It looked different now. When I had first entered, the metal archway had been rusted, the ticket booth abandoned, the turnstiles locked in place as if no one had entered in years. Now it was pristine. The letters above the entrance no longer read "closed forever." They read something else. Something new, "last chance." My stomach twisted. The girl didn't hesitate. She dragged me forward, and just as we reached the gate, the reflection screamed. A sound so inhuman, so wrong, it sent a shockwave through the air. I felt my body seize up. The girl stumbled. And for a moment, everything stopped. A choice stood before me. I could feel it in my bones, in my soul. If I stepped through that gate, something would change, something I couldn't take back. The park wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a living entity that had kept me trapped in its grasp, playing its twisted games, bending reality, pulling me deeper into its nightmare. And now it was offering me a deal. Stay, and you become part of it. Leave, and you lose something. But what? My memories, a part of my soul, or something worse? I locked eyes with the girl. She was breathing hard, her expression unreadable. "You have to choose," she whispered. Behind me, the reflection had stopped moving. It was watching, waiting because it knew. One way or another, the park always gets something. I took a step forward, and then I made my choice. I stepped forward. My heart pounded as my foot crossed the threshold of the exit gate. The moment I did, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in atmospheric pressure, a weight pressing against my skull. Then the ground trembled. Not violently, not like an earthquake. It was deeper than that. A slow, ominous pulse, as if the very heartbeat of the park was reacting to my choice. Behind me, the reflection twitched. It didn't lunge, it didn't scream. It just watched, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, its twisted mouth smiling. And then it spoke, but not aloud. Its voice slid into my mind like a whisper in the dark. A voice so close, so intimate, that it felt as if it was already inside me. "You'll never truly leave." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't stop. I pushed forward, pulling the girl with me. Past the turnstiles, past the last chance sign that flickered above our heads. And the moment we crossed completely, the world snapped. The colors returned in a flash, no longer distorted and wrong. The sky above was normal, a dull gray, clouded but real. The stale scent of popcorn and rusted metal that had clung to the air was gone. Instead, the air smelled like rain, like earth, like something fresh. The street outside the park stretched before us, lined with empty lampposts and flickering neon signs from rundown diners. It was quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. We had made it, we were out, but something was wrong. I turned back. The park entrance loomed behind us, dark and motionless. The rusted archway still stood, its chipped letters barely legible, but the sign had changed again. No longer did it say last chance. Now it said something else. Something that sent a deep, sinking feeling into my gut. See you soon. I felt a pressure in my head. A dull, nagging sensation. Not pain exactly, more like something was missing. Something had been taken. I turned to the girl. She was staring at me. Her expression was unreadable. "What?" I asked. She hesitated. Then, softly, she said, "What's your name?" The question hit me like a shockwave. Because suddenly I didn't know. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I tried to reach for it. Tried to grasp onto some shred of my identity, my past, my existence before this night. But all I found was silence, the park. It had taken something from me, and now, I wasn't sure I had ever really existed at all. I staggered back. The realization sunk its claws into me, wrapping around my lungs like a vice. Panic surged through my veins, but deep down a part of me already knew. It made sense, didn't it? I had wandered into a place that shouldn't exist. I had played by its rules. I had tried to escape, and the park, it had simply collected its price. You don't remember, do you? The girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. A hollow emptiness filled my chest. No name, no past, just nothing. And yet something inside me shifted. Like a locked door cracking open just an inch. Because while I didn't know my name, I remembered the park. Every detail, every twisted corridor, every impossible ride. I remembered the reflection that had chased me, the voices that whispered in the dark, the feeling of reality breaking apart around me. And worst of all, I remembered that I wasn't the first. The others, the ones before me, they had been here too. And maybe they had never truly left. I swallowed hard, looking back at the entrance one last time. The sign flickered. The iron gate stood open, just slightly as if waiting, inviting. A slow, sinking realization settled over me. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The park had me now. Even out here, in the normal world, in the quiet streets beyond its grasp. I could feel it. Like an unseen hand resting on my shoulder. A presence I would never shake. I had left the park, but a part of me would always belong to it. And sooner or later, I would go back. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the rusted entrance sign. See you soon. The words glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. My hands clenched into fists. The air outside the park felt lighter, but inside me, inside my mind, there was a weight I couldn't shake. I turned to the girl. She was watching me carefully, her wide eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, pity, or something worse, recognition. "You remember the park, don't you?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was something sharp beneath it. Like she already knew the answer, I hesitated. My mouth felt dry. I remembered everything. The twisting pathways, the rides that didn't obey physics, the employees with their frozen smiles, the voices whispering my name in the dark. I just didn't remember who I was before I stepped inside. I nodded slowly. The girl exhaled. So do I. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I had assumed she was different. That she had been a normal girl caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, I wasn't sure. "How long have you been out?" I asked. Her expression didn't change. Instead, she just stared at me for a long moment before finally answering. "I don't know." The words hit me harder than I expected. The wind picked up around us. A loose newspaper tumbled down the empty street, flapping like a wounded bird. Something about the silence out here felt wrong. Like the world beyond the park was just empty. Like we had stepped out of one nightmare and into something just as twisted. I looked down at my hands. They trembled slightly. I could still feel the phantom sensation of cold metal, of turnstiles and rusted railings. The weight of the park's presence lingered. I swallowed hard. "How did you get out?" I asked. The girl tilted her head. "That's the thing," she said. Her voice was distant, almost hollow. "I don't remember ever going in." A slow chill crept up my spine. The streetlights buzzed overhead. For the first time since we left the park, I noticed something odd. The buildings around us were wrong, not in a huge way, just off. The diner across the street had no entrance. Its neon sign flickered, "Eat at Joe's," but the windows were dark, no movement, no people inside. The gas station on the corner had pumps, but no prices. And the billboard above us, it was blank, not painted over, just empty, like something had forgotten to fill it in. A creeping suspicion slithered into my mind. I turned back to the girl. "You said you don't remember going in," I repeated slowly. She nodded. "So how do you remember getting out?" The moment I said it, something in her face changed. Her breath hitched, a flicker of realization, then fear. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her jacket. She started, then stopped, because she didn't have an answer. The truth hit me like a freight train. Maybe she hadn't left the park. Maybe I hadn't either. Maybe the exit was just another ride. The moment the thought entered my mind, the air shifted. The flickering diner sign brightened. The gas station's pumps hummed. The blank billboard filled in. I turned my head, my pulse hammering. Words spread across the empty space in thick, crimson letters. "Welcome to the park." I stumbled back. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." The girl grabbed my arm. Her fingers were ice cold. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We never left." The streetlights buzzed louder. The ground beneath us trembled. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a carousel began to play, but this time it was closer. The sound of the carousel grew louder. Not distant, not fading. It was moving toward us. My stomach twisted. I turned to the girl, but she was already staring at me, her face pale beneath the glow of the flickering streetlights. "We never left," she whispered again, and this time I believed her. The air around us felt thicker, charged with a strange, electric tension. I could feel the park watching us. The gas station, the diner, the billboard, none of them were real. They were set pieces, a manufactured illusion, and now that I had seen through it, it was breaking apart. The carousel music swelled, distorted and off-key, a nightmarish mockery of its usual cheerful tune. The pavement beneath our feet shifted, and for the first time, I noticed something horrifying. The cracks in the road weren't cracks at all. They were seams, like a poorly constructed stage, like the world itself was just a thin layer of paint stretched over something else. I took a step back and my foot sank, not onto pavement, not onto dirt, but onto something soft, something that moved. I yanked my leg back with a shudder, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The girl grabbed my arm. "We have to go," she said. "But where?" I stammered. She didn't answer, because the streetlights were bending. They twisted and warped, curving toward us like reaching arms. The buildings flickered. For a split second, I saw what was underneath. Not walls, not wood or brick, but shifting flesh, pulsing, alive. The park wasn't just a place. It was a thing, and it had never let us go. I grabbed the girl's wrist and ran. The illusion shattered around us. The gas station peeled away, revealing a darkened midway behind it. The diner collapsed inward, the neon sign flickering before disappearing completely. The billboard tore open, revealing something watching us from the other side. I didn't stop to see what it was. I just ran. The ground beneath us shifted with each step. Sometimes it was pavement. Sometimes it was wood. Sometimes it was something else entirely. I didn't look down. I couldn't, not if I wanted to keep running. The girl's grip was tight in mine. Neither of us spoke. Not until we reached the edge of the street and found ourselves back at the entrance. "See you soon." The glowing sign above the rusted gates looked exactly the same. No exit, no way out. Just the park, waiting. I swallowed hard. "I don't understand," I whispered. The girl stared at the gates, her expression unreadable. Her fingers trembled against my skin. Then she let go. I turned to her, confused. "What are you doing?" Her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them I hadn't before. Not fear, not panic. Acceptance. "I remember now," she said softly. "What?" Her voice wavered. "I never left the park." Her words sent a chill through me. I took a step back. "What are you talking about?" She smiled. A small, sad smile. I wasn't supposed to leave. Her body flickered. For a split second, she was transparent, like a reflection in glass. Then she was solid again, but something was wrong. Her shadow stretched behind her, but not in the shape of a girl. Something taller, something watching. The park had never let us go because it was still inside us, and one of us wasn't leaving. The girl turned to the gate. She placed a hand on the rusted metal, and for the first time, the bars opened effortlessly. Beyond them, the midway stretched into the darkness. Lights flickered, a ride word to life in the distance. The park was waiting for her, and she was ready to go back. I wanted to stop her, to grab her hand and pull her away, but deep down, I already knew the truth. She wasn't real. She never had been. She had always been part of this place, and now she was finally going home. The last thing I saw before she stepped inside was her smile. Soft, sad, relieved. Then the gates swung shut, and I was alone. The carousel slowed, the music faded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the park was silent. The silence felt wrong. The girl was gone. The gates had shut, and yet I was still here. I turned in a slow circle, my heart hammering. The midway stretched out before me, dark and empty. No lights, no music, no movement, just rows of abandoned stalls and rusted rides, swallowed by the gloom. For the first time since I stepped into this nightmare, the park was still. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt watched. I took a shaky step backward. The pavement beneath my feet felt too smooth, like I was standing on glass. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look down, and I froze. Beneath my feet wasn't pavement, it wasn't dirt, it was reflection, and the reflection wasn't mine. I stared into the dark surface, my breath catching. The face looking back at me was wrong, not quite mine. The features were too sharp, the eyes were too dark, and then, with a slow, jerking motion, it smiled. I stumbled back, my pulse slamming in my ears. The glass beneath me rippled, like a stone dropped into water. The figure in the reflection didn't move with me. It just stood there, watching, grinning, and then it stepped forward. The surface shattered, not like breaking glass, like something ripping open. I fell backward, barely catching myself as the ground beneath me split apart. The air changed, the scent of rust and old popcorn faded. The cold, damp air of the midway vanished. And suddenly, I wasn't in the theme park anymore. I was in my bedroom. I gasped, my chest heaving. My sheets were twisted around me. The glow of my bedside lamp flickered in the corner of my eye. The carnival sounds were gone. The empty rides, the endless pathways, the flickering neon signs, all of it. Gone. I was home, or at least it looked like home. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling. Something still felt wrong. The air was too still. The silence was too deep. I turned my head, scanning the familiar room, the desk, the closet, the old movie posters on the wall. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, and yet I could still feel it watching me. Like the park had followed me home, a sudden sound made my stomach drop. A soft, mechanical chime, familiar, unmistakable, the sound of my phone getting a notification. I turned toward my nightstand. The screen was glowing in the darkness. One new message, from a number I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I reached for the phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I did. And the second I saw the message, the breath left my lungs. It was a photo of me, standing at the entrance of the theme park, the neon sign above my head glowing in the dark. See you soon. My stomach twisted. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was home. I had escaped, hadn't I? My heart pounded as I slowly turned toward the window. Outside, the night stretched endlessly. The street was empty. The world was quiet. And then, in the distance, a single neon light flickered to life. The park was still here, and it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't breathe. The neon light in the distance flickered again. Once, twice, and then It stayed on. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was home, I had escaped, I was safe. Right, the message on my phone glowed in the darkness. See you soon. A photo of me, standing at the entrance of the theme park. But I hadn't taken it. I hadn't been there. Not anymore had I. I moved toward the window, my breath shaking. The neon glow pulsed against the night, distant but too close at the same time. I squinted, trying to make out what was beyond it, and my stomach dropped. The street outside wasn't mine. The buildings weren't my neighbors' houses. The sidewalk wasn't cracked the way it should be. I wasn't looking out at my quiet suburban street. I was looking at the midway. A wave of nausea hit me. I staggered back from the window, my mind racing. How was this happening? I was home. I was in my room, wasn't I? I turned in a slow circle, scanning the space. The familiar posters, the lamp I'd had since childhood, the old desk covered in notebooks and clutter. It all looked right, but it felt wrong, like something had been rebuilt, recreated, like someone had tried to make it look like home but had missed the details. I rushed to my bedroom door, heart pounding. I grabbed the handle and twisted locked. I yanked harder. Nothing, I was trapped. A sudden noise made my skin crawl. A soft, mechanical hum, low and distant. Growing closer, I turned toward the window just in time to see it. A ride moving in the distance, a Ferris wheel. Lit up in flickering, broken lights, turning slowly, endlessly. The same Ferris wheel I'd seen in the theme park. But it wasn't in the park anymore. It was right outside my house. My legs felt like lead. I watched in horror as the lights pulsed, the seats swaying gently in the dark. And then one seat stopped at the very top, and something was inside it. A shape, small, still, watching me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, and then the phone buzzed again, a new message. I didn't want to look. But my body moved on its own. Slowly I turned, picked up the phone, looked at the screen, new message, a single sentence. Look behind you. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to turn, I didn't want to see, but I could feel it. Standing just behind me, watching, waiting, I turned and the lights cut out. Everything went black. Darkness, total, absolute, suffocating darkness. I couldn't see, I couldn't move, I could only hear it. A soft, rhythmic sound, breathing, not mine, something else, something too close. I forced my body to move. A step back, another. My foot hit something solid and then click. A sudden light cut through the dark. My phone screen, still in my hand, and on it a reflection. A shape behind me, too tall, too thin, too wrong. Standing just inches away, I spun around, nothing. Only the dark, only the faint hum of electricity. Only the distant sound of the rides, still turning, still running, still waiting. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking. There had to be a way out. I had escaped once. I could do it again, couldn't I? A notification popped up on the screen. A new message. I stared at it, not wanting to open it, not wanting to know, but my hands moved on their own. I tapped the screen, the message loaded, welcome home. The room shifted, the air felt thicker. I tried to breathe, but the walls felt closer. The ceiling lower. The objects in my room, they weren't mine anymore. They weren't even real. A distant chime rang out. Slow, melodic, like an announcement over an intercom, and then a voice, familiar, wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, the park is now open. I fell to my knees. No, 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 no. This wasn't happening. I was home. I had made it home, hadn't I? The window changed. The dark sky outside rippled like a painted backdrop, flickering, glitching, like a ride that was about to restart. And then I heard it. Footsteps, not one pair, dozens, hundreds, coming closer, from the hallway, from outside. From everywhere, and the carousel music began to play. I screamed. I ran for the door, yanking, pulling it flew open. But what was beyond it wasn't my house. It was the park, bright, glowing, waiting, and the people, the staff. The ones who never blinked, the ones who had never left. They stood in rows along the midway, still, silent, smiling, waiting for me to step through. I took a step back. I couldn't go in. If I did, I knew I'd never leave. Not this time, not ever, but then a voice, soft, right beside me, whispering in my ear, "You already did." I turned, and the lights cut out. The park never closes, and neither do I. Welcome home, the end.